Hello, and welcome to a session on IEPs, and today's session will be about present levels of performance. We're going to be doing these weekly, every other week webinars for about 30 minutes during your lunch to address different components of the IEP process, and today we're going to be looking specifically at present levels of performance. My name is Angela Kwok, and I will be here with you today to talk to you a little bit about expectations for present levels of performance and how it creates the foundation for the rest of the IEP. So without further ado, here we go into the objectives today. We're first going to define what present levels of performance are, address their purpose, several different data sources, what kind of content to include in a present levels of performance, and an example of present levels of performance with the strengths and weaknesses. Here's an example of a PLAAFP cartoon. We know that too often in special education we use a lot of acronyms. So in IDA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, they have the PLAAFP, and that stands for the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So that acronym at the very bottom, I'm going to be reading that sentence. It says the acronym commonly used for present levels of academic achievement and functional performance is PLAAFP, but sometimes we call it short and just use present levels of performance. But in any context of what we're referencing, it ultimately means the same thing. It means where the student is presently performing. Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, each IEP must include a statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. And that includes how the child's disability affects the child's involvement in progress in the general education curriculum, and that means how their progress is in comparison as non-disabled peers, and for preschool children as appropriate, how their disability affects child's participation in age-appropriate activities. Here we have a present levels of performance and a picture of a house, because present levels of performance create the foundation of an entire IEP. You really want a strong foundation so that the rest of the IEP has enough structure to support itself and stand strong. The word present is in red because it's very important that information that's included in the present levels of performance is current and relevant. We're going to be really addressing this hard this year because it's an expectation that the information that is on the present levels of performance is current. We're not asking to have a 3-year reevaluation every single year, but reevaluation information that has been done is appropriate to put here, and then any other kind of screeners, instrument tools, district state assessments that have been done within the past year should also be considered as part of that language that is included in the present levels of performance. The reason we have a present levels of performance is because it drives the entire IEP. It creates that snapshot that any one person reading the entire IEP can get a quick snapshot of what the student is able to do, what his or her weaknesses are, what the disability addresses, accommodations, supports for personnel, anything that's relevant to the child that would need to be addressed in the entire rest of the IEP to consider for services or supports. In this slide, the statement says the present levels of performance provides information based on how to drive goal development, how to develop objectives, supports, accommodations, and services. That present levels of performance is so critical because whatever it states will drive the entire rest of the IEP. So if it's a student's strengths or weakness, then that should align with the services, supports, accommodations, goals. Again, this is something that we have seen as a weakness across Oklahoma, and we will be really targeting as professional development this year to make sure each IEP is individualized for that student and that the entire IEP is aligned to make sure that if it's addressed as an area of weakness, that that area of weakness is addressed throughout the rest of the IEP. I put this picture of a doctor in here because it's a great analogy that when you go into a doctor, and you say, okay, I need a particular medication. Well, before he just issues you your medication, he wants to know what all the symptoms are. What experiences do you have that would necessitate that need for medication? So he'll probably check your fever, check to see if you have any other concerns, vomiting, stomach bug, those kind of things, because it's very important to know what symptoms you have in order to know the best possible course of action. And it's a very similar analogy to an IEP, because you need to know where the student is currently performing so that you can address that need appropriately. The data for present levels of performance comes from a variety of sources. Now, we're not saying that you must include each and every one of these sources of data. We're just saying that it shouldn't just be a statement of, Sally is a great friend and she is sweet to have in class. Okay, that is a sentence and it does describe Sally as being friendly. However, it's a very weak present levels of performance, because there's so much more to Sally than we don't know from that statement alone. We want to know where she's performing academically. We want to know what motivates her, what is her disability. So any type of data that you can use to inform that information on the present levels will make a much stronger present levels of performance, and that way it's not just language that you're trying to come up with. It's truly from a source that's reliable and drives the rest of development of what needs are there for Sally. So the data can include several different sources, and we've bulleted them here, but I'm going to go through each one of them. The very first one says that present levels of performance can come from individualized, group, or curriculum-based or norm-referenced assessments. So that can be district-wide assessments, it can be statewide assessments, it can be just a screener. A lot of schools do like star reading, star math. Those are okay to include, but it just should not be that one instrument alone. We're saying the data comes from a variety of sources. A student's performance in relationship to his or her same-age peers. We know that students need access to grade-level curriculum. And knowing that expectation, where is the student currently performing now? What is his or her ability level? And where does he or she need to go? So how far do we need to close that achievement gap? State and district assessments are quite helpful to know whether they met benchmark last year. Also, structured observations. Maybe you have a formalized teacher observation log, or it was a formalized functional behavior assessment where somebody from outside came in and did a formal evaluation observing the student in the classroom. Those observations can be helpful information. Sometimes those observations include information about what was happening before an event occurred, or what motivated the child to exhibit that certain behavior, whether it was task avoidance or whether it was to gain attention-seeking behavior. Also, work samples can be quite helpful. Is the student understanding a particular concept, or is the skill just misunderstood in some capacity? Sometimes it can also be a sample of writing and how his or her handwriting attributes to an area of need. At the very front of an IEP, it asks for parent concerns or comments. And sometimes prior to an IEP meeting, you may have had open communication with parents or even a student to know his or her needs, long-term goals. Those can be important to include in the present levels of performance, because when you're driving the foundation for the rest of the IEP, a strong knowledge about where the student ultimately wants to go can help accomplish some of his or her goals from the onset. We also know that factors related to the disability can be relevant information. So if the student has a disability where recess needs to take into account whether they need to stay inside for cold recess days, whether they need to go to the counselor at noon to take insulin, all of those are relevant factors that, yes, it may be information included in the services page, but we're going to just go ahead and put it in the present levels of performance section because it's giving an overall picture of a need for that student. And finally, transcripts and cumulative records. We're not asking for you to input the entire transcript or cumulative record in the present levels of performance, but we're saying it can be a source for some of the data that you may be wanting. Good rules of thumb when you're thinking about present levels of performance. Remember, this is a snapshot for creating the foundation for the entire IEP. So we want to make sure it uses very clear and understandable language, not only for parents that may not be up with all the educational jargon or lingo, but we want to make sure that it avoids very generic terms such as, oh, he understands how to do algebra, or he's a good student, or he misbehaves every time the sub is gone, or every time the general education teacher is gone. So, you know, what is the misbehavior? Is it because there's a change in schedule and he or she just needs specific knowledge that there would be a change in routine? So whenever you can have an opportunity to clarify a generic statement, it's very helpful to do that. In the second bullet, it says, be clear by others reading the IEP of a role of an individual. So when you say, well, Philip goes to Mrs. Smith's class 2 hours a day, well, somebody from a different district reading the IEP for the first time, they don't know who Mrs. Phillips is. So define an individual's role rather than using names for an area. So if it's he or she needs to cool off after recess by going to a counselor's office, or if it's he or she goes to Mrs. Smith's resource room twice a day, it's a learning lab room, it can be helpful to know exactly how that service can be offered in multiple settings. Also spell out acronyms. So often we read IEPs and it uses the terminology of GE or SS, and if you're not familiar with those terms, it can be, you know, just looking at another language. You know, 2.2 GE, what is that? Well, that just means 2.2 grade equivalency. So if it's a second grader and they're 2.2, you know that they're on grade level. However, if it's an 8th grader at 2.2, we know that that student is far below grade level. Also, same thing with standard score. If you're using a standard score of 62, put, you know, the average range next to that standard score so we can know whether that number is below, on average, or above average. Also, it's helpful to know that supports and accommodations that have been successful in the past. Anything that has been successful should be included in a new IEP because we know that those have been proven helpful in the past, and those should be continuously provided for that student to support their education. So have conversations with the parents, former educators, or even the student themselves to know accommodations that have proven helpful and whether changes are necessary. Whenever possible, be specific and use data to support the information included in the present levels of performance. The dates of your evaluation are important because if you say the student was on a 2.2 grade equivalency and the student is in grade 8, well, it's helpful to know whether that assessment was done this year or whether that was done 5 years ago when that student was in 2nd grade. So include the dates of the evaluation because it helps you know the context of what level that student was currently performing in the grade level. And finally, without data, the present levels of performance is only your opinion. So whenever possible, your statement should be supported by facts, not just, you know, context of, you know, like, oh, Sally is a smart child and she's very friendly and has supportive parents. You know, those are all just generalizations, and whenever possible, use that data to support the information that it can't be argued by any one person that was just your own opinion. Earlier I said that present levels of performance can include a variety of information, and that's true, and we're not saying that each one of these specific boxes must be included in the present levels of performance, but we're saying that there is a variety of areas that you can address to think about content for present levels of performance. You can think about including independent learning levels. Where is the student currently performing right now? What is his or her strengths or needs? What about a preferred method of delivery for instruction? Preferred language or communication need? Secondary transition or career preparation? Does the student have social skills that need to be addressed? Is there any adult support needs in the school setting? Also, are there any physical limitations or barriers in the school setting? Also, like health concerns, does there need to be a medical plan on file in the nurse's office? And finally, behavior. Is there anything that needs to be addressed specific to that student's behavior that may impede his or her learning ability or that of others? What's the present levels of performance? What does it do? Well, it gives a snapshot of a child at a particular time and place. So if this is the annual IEP, we know at this moment, at this time, this is where the student was currently performing. And we know this is his or her areas of strengths, weaknesses, and we know the level of achievement gap between where the student is currently performing and where he or she needs to be. It describes the level at which the student is currently working academically and functionally, and provides a clear picture of the child's strengths and needs based on all of that data we've previously addressed so far, based on the evaluation and performance of those assessments. It also identifies and prioritizes the child's specific needs. Some students may come to you and they may have so many needs, it's hard to pinpoint any one specific one that needs to be addressed first. So this present levels of performance helps pinpoint specific areas that need to be addressed so that can be addressed first and create the platform for all other learning opportunities. We also know that establishing a baseline from which to develop meaningful and measurable goals can be derived from this present levels of performance because, again, those have been, I guess, they've been categorized so that the greatest area of need is addressed first, and so that those areas of needs are prioritized so that appropriate goals can be composed specific to those areas of deficit. Aligning the entire IEP is very important so that the standards and benchmarks, annual goals, supplementary aid services, supports, and secondary transition services all complement each other and appropriately align. What should IEP teams consider when you're developing present levels of performance? Well, they should consider how that student's current levels of performance are in relationship to the student's grade level, district standards or benchmarks, and how the student is currently performing in relationship to those expectations. Also, it's important to know the functional areas of concern related to the disability that has not been reflected in the general education curriculum. A student may come to you and they may have more than just academic skills deficits alone. They may need additional help that's outside the educational curriculum, but it would help promote them to be more independent after high school, such as independent living, community care, self-care skills, social skills, classroom survival. Some of those need explicit direction on how to acquire those skills. And if that's a need for that specific student, one, it would first be addressed in the present levels of performance, and then second, it would be addressed somewhere else in the IEP through services or goals. And I think we've already addressed this, the skill gap of the child in the instructional environment, the strengths of the child and are relevant to address the identified concerns and relationship of the level of performance that will be required to achieve those goals. Academic achievement and functional performance areas We've said this whole time that it can include several different resources. Again, more resources for input in this particular area can include parent and student input and concerns. Anything the student might want to do after high school, long-term goals is quite relevant because we want to make sure that the student is getting all their credits necessary in high school. And if the student has some other types of goals, they can either do a career tech, they can do other courses they may be interested in, and develop those interests early on to make sure that that is exactly where they want to be for something after high school. Also, you would want to include academic information, communication, functional needs, general intelligence. Maybe if the student had an IQ test 3 years ago, you could include that information. Again, put the date that was conducted so it has context. We're not saying you have to do an IQ test every single year, but if you have that information, it could be included. And then any health or medical information as it's available. Also, we have motor skills, gross or fine motor. Gross means, like physical mobility. Fine motor is more the dexterity in your fingers and able to, compose composition with a pencil or paper. Speech language needs, sensory issues such as vision or hearing that may need to be addressed, social and emotional behavior, and any other concerns. In this next slide, I'm smiling because there's so many things that can be included in the present levels of performance. It's quite exhaustive. And we've gone through slide after slide of addressing exactly what information could be included. And I think it's really important to pause a moment and think that the IEP is individualized for that specific student. So when you're talking about, okay, Angela, I want to know, what do I include for present levels? Can you just summarize it real quick for me? What you really need to do is address where the student is currently performing and make sure that you have data to support what the information needs to include. So there's not one true black and white answer because it's individualized for each student. And again, this slide is just one of those other slides that gives you information to know what possible information could be included. It can include what the child can and cannot do, results of curriculum-based assessments, results on district and statewide assessments, and classroom academic performance with classwork and homework assignments. Typically, a student has already gone through the eligibility process to determine the student's area of disability. And so now that the team is writing the IEP, they already know the disability, and so the IEP is now addressing how that student's education may be impacting his or her learning based on that disability. This first bullet addresses that point by saying, how does the child's disability impact his or her involvement and progress in the general education curriculum? Meaning, how is he or she doing in comparison to the non-disabled children, and how is that impacting his or her learning? And then the next question, how does the student perform compared to expectations in the general education curriculum? How far is that achievement gap of where he or she is performing and where he or she needs to be? This just gives several different examples of how the disability impacts learning. It can impact the student's ability to read, write, do math calculations, speak, and or build or maintain interpersonal relationships. All of those are relevant and could be considered as part of this present level. For preschool children, there's an additional component. You want to make sure that you're addressing how the child's disability affects participation in age-appropriate activities and how the child's level of functioning compared to typically developing peers. So real quick, we have a reading example. This is Sarah. We're going to go over her strengths, we're going to go over her needs, and then we're going to drive a possible present levels of performance and see how well we did. So here's a snapshot of Sarah in language about her strengths. It's pretty typical with a lot of your students because Sarah has some reading difficulties, and we're going to read this strength and see how we could help Sarah. Sarah's able to read first grade literature books independently. Her fluency score is 61 words per minute, slightly under the target of 65 words per minute. So we know that she can do a good job with fluency. She reads common sight words at second grade level, and she blends words with 2- and 3-letter consonant blends as well as words with short and long vowel patterns. She is able to apply phonics skills to decode words during structured reading time. So again, strength is decoding and fluency. She's doing okay with that. Her needs is comprehension. Sarah is unable to comprehend grade level reading text. She has a difficulty stating main ideas, answering how and why questions, and reading with comprehension in other subject areas, such as social studies and science. Her score for answering comprehension questions is about 50%, or 5 out of 10, and her vocabulary score is 5 out of 10, about 50%, both of which are below target. She has difficulty participating in classroom discussions and completing reading comprehension assignments. So let's look at her impact of disability. Sarah's specific learning disability impairs her ability to comprehend what she reads, which impacts her involvement and progress in general education curriculum. So if I was to say that this is an example of Sarah's present levels of performance, is this an adequate statement based on everything that we talked about today? Well, I would say probably not. It's missing some information on where her current present levels of performance are. We did know that in the strengths and weaknesses, it did outline exactly where she was performing with a specific reading comprehension test, but we could probably include additional data sources to give more context about why she might be struggling with the area of comprehension. When you're looking at your own present levels of performance, you can consider the following 3 questions. Number 1, do the descriptions provide enough information to understand where the student is currently functioning? So in Sarah's example, yes, we had enough information to know that she was struggling with reading comprehension. However, more data would be necessary to address what specifically would be helpful for Sarah when we're thinking about appropriate goals and services. Number 2, is there sufficient information to develop appropriate goals and objectives? And number 3, is it clear how the disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum? So I think one of the things with Sarah is, what grade is she in, and does she need any accommodations? What is her disability? All of those things help create a better picture to help Sarah in the classroom. Well, with summarizing everything that we've talked about today, we'd just like to appreciate the time that you have spent with us and hope that it helps clarify a little bit information about present levels of performance and how you can compose quality present levels of performances within each one of your IEPs. We will be hosting these IEP webinar series every other week during lunch breaks from 11 to 11:30 or 11:45 to 12:15. If you have any information, you can feel free to contact us on this screen. Our special education number is 405-521-3351, and we appreciate you being with us today. Thanks.